Was a king truly powerless, or merely playing a deadly game of chess with his own fate? Could ambition drown a kingdom in a tide of betrayal and blood? The rain in Oxfordshire always smelled of iron and regret. It clung to the grey stones of Radcot Bridge, slick with the perpetual dampness of the Cotswolds, mirroring the chill that had settled over England in late December 1387. It wasn't just the weather that was bleak, it was the air itself, thick with the scent of fear and the unspoken dread of a kingdom teetering on the precipice of chaos. Robert de Vere, the Duke of Ireland, a man sculpted from arrogance and ambition, moved with a desperate urgency through the fog, a solitary figure swallowed by the gloom, his 1,000 men a flickering shadow against the darkening landscape. He wasn't hunting a deer or seeking a forgotten treasure. He was running from the consequences of a decision, a gamble, a fatal miscalculation. Just a year before, the air in Westminster had been electric with fury. The wonderful Parliament, they'd called it, a moniker dripping with irony. It wasn't a celebration, it was a reckoning. The king, a boy of 19, Richard II, had been utterly, spectacularly blindsided. His advisors, his carefully cultivated image, his carefully laid plans for a French invasion, all reduced to ashes by a parliament demanding answers, demanding justice, demanding control. The Scottish campaign had been a disaster, a humiliating retreat that had fueled whispers of conspiracies, of chamber knights hungry for power, of plots to assassinate the young king. And then came the rumors about Charles VI, the French king, building a colossal armada, a forest of masts, as one chronicler described it, aimed squarely at the shores of England. Richard, a man accustomed to deference and unquestioning obedience, had been confronted with a chilling memo, a stark warning delivered with unnerving precision. Attach to himself persons of estate, of probity and of honor, and to associate with them and eschew the company of others. For if he does this, great good and honor will come to him, and he will win the hearts and love of his people. But if he does the opposite, then the contrary will happen, to the great danger of himself and his realm, which God forbid. The response: the king will do as he chooses. A laconic dismissal that spoke volumes about the precariousness of his position. The Parliament rolls, meticulously documenting every grievance, every demand, offered a grim tableau. The meager taxes granted, a pittance compared to the kingdom's needs, were now utterly wasted. The king, perpetually impoverished, had decided to elevate his friend de Vere to the position of Duke of Ireland. A bold move, certainly, but one that carried a chilling resonance. De Vere became the first duke not of the royal blood, a blatant assertion of power, a direct challenge to the established order. It was a comparison almost impossible to ignore. De Vere versus Gaveston, the disgraced earl, a reminder of past abuses and the potential for future tyranny. The wonderful Parliament, a name now laced with bitter irony, was born out of a deep-seated crisis of leadership. Michael de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, a man whose ambition burned brighter than his judgment, announced the king's intention to lead an invasion of France, a declaration met with immediate and explosive outrage. The Commons, a volatile and increasingly assertive body, blamed de la Pole for squandering the kingdom's wealth, for neglecting the navy, for abandoning English allies in Ghent, leading to the city's fall to the Duke of Burgundy. He was a figurehead for incompetence, a symbol of the king's disastrous advisors. Their demands were simple: remove de la Pole, impeach him, and restore some semblance of order. Richard, predictably, refused to comply. He sent a message from his manor at Eltham, a defiant declaration that he would not even dismiss a scullion boy without the Parliament's consent. In a desperate attempt to mediate, his uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, newly Duke of Gloucester, and the Bishop of Ely, Thomas Arundel, were dispatched to Eltham, armed with the unenviable task of reasoning with a king consumed by paranoia. What they found was a scene of utter chaos. Richard, described by the chronicler Henry Knighton as in a shrill and belligerent mood, raged against the Commons' audacity. He refused to come to Westminster, declaring his intention to rule as he saw fit. He dismissed the attempts at negotiation, branding the assembled lords and commons as rebellious, as traitors plotting to usurp his throne. He even invoked the ghost of Edward II, the deposed king whose reign had been stained by scandal and betrayal, suggesting that the very people demanding reform were driven by a thirst for vengeance, a desire to repeat the mistakes of the past. The judges, pressured by the king, delivered a chilling verdict. All those who had constrained him in 1386, those who had dared to question his authority, to demand accountability, were to be considered traitors. A sweeping, dangerous definition that effectively criminalized any attempt to govern responsibly. This was a deliberate attempt to stifle dissent, to silence any voice that dared to challenge his rule. Richard's subsequent gyration, a 9-month tour of the realm, was not a display of benevolent leadership, but a calculated effort to gauge his support, to consolidate his power, to build a loyal base independent of the troublesome Parliament. He surrounded himself with his friends de Vere and Michael de la Pole, and began to cultivate a personal army, paying loyal men to wear his badges, to protect his interests, to fight for him, a private force designed to circumvent the authority of the crown. He wasn't interested in reform, he was interested in control. He sought to transform himself into a powerful private landowner, a king beholden to no one but himself. During the summer of 1387, he secretly convened with the leading judges, led by Sir Robert Tresilian, the Chief Justice, and browbeat them into issuing rulings that declared the ordinances of the wonderful Parliament derogatory to the regality and prerogative of our said Lord the King. Essentially, they were invalidating any attempt to hold him accountable. The atmosphere in London grew increasingly tense. The Lords and Commons, emboldened by their victory, began to plot against de Vere, the architect of the kingdom's woes. They formed an appellant faction, accusing him of treason, of corruption, of undermining the king's authority. The list of charges was staggering: mismanagement of funds, misappropriation of royal income, abandonment of allies, and most damningly, a conspiracy to overthrow the king. De Vere, a man accustomed to deference and loyalty, found himself facing a united front of powerful enemies. He recognized the gravity of the situation and, with a desperate urgency, began to gather his forces, recruiting men from the king's earldom of Chester, assembling an army of thousands. He intended to march directly to London to confront his enemies head-on, to reclaim his position at the king's side, but the road to London was fraught with peril. The countryside was crawling with appellant troops dispatched by Gloucester, Warwick, and Arundel to capture de Vere and bring him to justice. Villages were occupied, roads were blocked, and the countryside was a network of hidden dangers. As de Vere rode south, a chilling realization dawned on him. He wasn't just facing military opposition, he was facing a legal siege. The judges had effectively declared anyone who had challenged the king's authority to be a traitor. His very existence was a threat to the established order. On December 20th, as the rain continued to fall on Oxfordshire, de Vere found himself trapped at Radcot Bridge. He had been lured into a trap by Gloucester, who had anticipated his movements and erected barriers, preventing him from crossing the river. As he desperately attempted to flee, he encountered Derby's forces, a formidable army of loyalists determined to crush his rebellion. The battle was brief and brutal. De Vere's men, demoralized and outnumbered, quickly surrendered. The Duke himself, abandoning his horse, plunged into the icy waters of the Thames, a desperate act of survival. He swam to the other side, a testament to his courage and his determination to escape capture, but his escape was merely a temporary reprieve. The Lords and Commons, emboldened by their victory, demanded the king's immediate attention. They expelled de la Pole and Sir John Fordham from their positions, establishing a commission to oversee the royal finances and exercise control over the exchequer. In essence, they stripped Richard of his power, reducing him to a figurehead, a boy king utterly dependent on the goodwill of his subjects. The wonderful Parliament had achieved its purpose. It had dismantled Richard's authority, exposed his weaknesses, and established a new system of governance, one that placed the interests of the realm above the ambitions of the crown. Richard, a young man barely out of his teens, was once again a boy, his kingship effectively revoked. The final blow came in November 1387, when Richard, desperate to regain control, secretly convened with the leading judges and browbeat them into issuing rulings that declared the ordinances of the wonderful Parliament derogatory to the regality and prerogative of our said Lord the King. Essentially, they were invalidating any attempt to hold him accountable. The court was a dangerous place. The threat of treason loomed large, and Richard, fueled by paranoia and a deep-seated resentment, began to view his advisors with suspicion. He saw conspiracies everywhere, plots to overthrow him, attempts to undermine his authority. The chronicler Henry Knighton recorded a chilling scene: Richard, Gloucester, and Arundel confronting the king in the chambers of Eltham Palace. The king, consumed by rage, accused his uncle and the bishop of plotting against him, of seeking to depose him and install his cousin, the King of France, as his successor. He even invoked the ghost of Edward II, suggesting that the very people demanding reform were driven by a thirst for vengeance, a desire to repeat the mistakes of the past. The Lords and Commons, sensing an opportunity, pressed their demands. They threatened to dissolve the Parliament if Richard did not concede to their demands. Faced with this ultimatum, Richard was forced to yield, to accept the reforms, to acknowledge the authority of the Parliament. The wonderful Parliament concluded with a resounding victory for the Commons. De la Pole and Fordham were removed from their positions, and a commission was established to oversee the royal finances. Richard, stripped of his power, was forced to watch in ignominy as his authority was dismantled piece by piece. As the Parliament adjourned, Richard, a young man overwhelmed by the weight of his responsibilities, retreated to his hunting lodges in the Thames Valley, brooding in isolation, consumed by resentment and anger. He began to formulate a plan to regain his authority, to rebuild his power base, to challenge the reforms imposed upon him. He realized that he could not rely on the goodwill of the Parliament. He needed to cultivate a loyal following, to build a personal army, to become a powerful landowner independent of the crown. He began to retain personnel, paying them for their loyalty, equipping them with badges and uniforms, and promising them protection and support. He effectively transformed himself into a private magnate, a king beholden to no one but himself. Simultaneously, he sought to undermine the reforms by appealing to the judges, arguing that the ordinances of the wonderful Parliament were derogatory to the regality and prerogative of our said Lord the King. He effectively declared them invalid, paving the way for a new wave of repression. As Richard prepared to return to London, he was confronted by a new threat: the Lords Appellant, a faction of powerful nobles led by Gloucester, Warwick, and Arundel, who were determined to bring him to justice and punish those who had challenged his authority. They presented a list of charges against the king's advisors, accusing them of treason, of corruption, and of conspiring to overthrow the crown. The charges were damning, and the implications were terrifying. If convicted, the accused would face imprisonment, exile, or even death. Richard, sensing the danger, retreated into himself, consumed by paranoia and fear. As de Vere prepared to march on London, he knew that he was facing a formidable enemy. The combined armies of Gloucester, Warwick, and Arundel, bolstered by the support of London's leading families and knights, were determined to capture him and bring him to justice. The countryside was a battleground, and the threat of violence was ever present. De Vere, a man accustomed to luxury and privilege, found himself thrust into a world of mud, blood, and betrayal. On December 20th, as the rain continued to fall on Oxfordshire, de Vere's forces clashed with Gloucester's troops at Burton on the Hill. The battle was brief and chaotic, and de Vere's men quickly retreated. Later that day at Burford, de Vere encountered Arundel's forces. The fighting was even more desperate, and de Vere's lieutenant, Sir Thomas Molyneux, was killed. As de Vere desperately attempted to cross the river, he found himself trapped at Radcot Bridge. He had been lured into a trap by Gloucester, who had erected barriers, preventing him from escaping. With no other option, de Vere abandoned his horse and plunged into the icy waters of the Thames, a desperate act of survival. As he swam to the other side, he was confronted by Darby's forces, a formidable army of loyalists determined to crush his rebellion. The battle was swift and decisive. De Vere's men quickly surrendered, and the Duke himself was captured. As Richard watched the events unfold from Windsor Castle, he was filled with a chilling realization. He had been played, manipulated, betrayed. His ambitions had led him to a perilous precipice, and he had fallen into a trap of his own making. The rain continued to fall on Oxfordshire, washing away the blood and the mud, but not the stain of betrayal. The kingdom was once again plunged into chaos, and Richard, a young man stripped of his power and his dignity, was left to face the consequences of his choices. Was a king truly powerless, or merely playing a deadly game of chess with his own fate? Could ambition drown a kingdom in a tide of betrayal and blood?